The video game industry has yet again taken another step towards the future. And with the revealing of NVIDIA's RTX 50 series GPUs, this is no exception. However, is this an evolutionary step? And is it done in an efficient way? What are the technological innovations that have taken place in this current generation that has just been announced? Well, we're going to take a further look today, using the lens and understanding of nanotechnology to best understand where the industry is heading, where it is at right now, and what innovations are on the horizon. Because as of right now, people are questioning whether or not this is a good investment. Well, let's take a further look.
Okay, so those are the speeds and feeds, so how does it compare? Well, this is RTX 4090. I know many of you have one. And now for $1,500 and $1,599, you get to upgrade that and turbocharge the living daylights out of it. Well, now with the Blackwell family, RTX 5070, 4090 performance at $549.
Most PC gamers and tech gurus can quickly understand that this is not actually true.
Impossible without artificial intelligence. Impossible without the 4 teraops of AI tensor cores. Impossible without the G7 memories.
While RAM and AI modules are an important part of the progression of the RTX 50 series, the main component has always been and will always be the actual number of cores themselves. And during the process of manufacturing, the number of cores that are successfully generated are what determines the price cost of the different tiers of the graphics units. Now, I want to take a look at an example from the 30 series, and this illustration from Branch Education perfectly explains the difference between the tiers of the graphics processing units.
Is that the 3080, 3090, 3080 Ti, and 3090 Ti graphics cards all use the same GA102 chip design for their GPU. This might be counterintuitive because they have different prices and were released in different years, but it's true. So why is this? Well, during the manufacturing process, sometimes patterning errors, dust particles, or other manufacturing issues cause damage and create defective areas of the circuit. Instead of throwing out the entire chip because of a small defect, engineers find the defective region and permanently isolate and deactivate the nearby circuitry. By having a GPU with a highly repetitive design, a small defect in one core only damages that particular streaming multiprocessor circuit and doesn't affect the other areas of the chip. As a result, these chips are tested and categorized or binned according to the number of defects.
And in essence, this is the tax that PC gamers will pay to get access to the newest technology, the latest nodes. However, the actual tiers that you see from 70, 70 Ti, 80, 90, and so on and so forth is technically similar to the percentage of cores that are actually successful during the manufacturing process. And so you may have up to 16 defective processors in a 3080 or a 4080 or a 5080, and that has to do with the sheer amount of defects that are on the chip. But if a 50 series chip has the same amount of defects as a 40 series chip, it will still have more CUDA cores because the density is increased going from a 5 nanometer node down to a 4 nanometer node, which is technically about a 20% increase in overall transistor density. And so when you're looking at it like that, you get a better understanding of what to expect when it comes to a next generation. It comes down to the nanotechnological process that TSMC and Samsung are able to produce for their chips, which is the base product. It works the same way with CPUs as well.
And here's the whole family, starting from 5070 all the way up to 5090. 5090, twice the performance of a 4090. Starting, of course, we're producing at very large scale, availability starting January.
Modern GPUs also have specialized cores that are for specific calculations, like for ray tracing or AI-based purposes, and this also adds things to the die in an efficient way that sometimes can affect the cost, but overall can add much more performance on a sideways grade evolution. Mark Cerny, for example, outlined the PlayStation 5 Pro's graphical enhancements to its GPU, where the base model is comprised of 36 compute units split into groups of 2 to create 18 total work groups, while the PlayStation 5 Pro used a total of 30 work groups that was made out of 60 compute units out of a possible 64. And so this tells you that about 4 CUs, or 2 work groups, were disabled for every chip, which gives us about a approximate 94% yield, which is actually pretty damn good considering that this was actually made on a 4 nanometer process. And while absolute perfect yields can be used, they actually disable 2 of the work groups to make sure that a level playing field is achieved across all of the chips that are made on a silicon wafer, meaning this, that the only ones that are accepted for the PS5 Pro are the equivalent of a 90, or what would be considered like a 90 Super of sorts. This is actually very impressive because on any given wafer there's a whole bunch of chips that are made, and you're only getting the best of the best for the PlayStation 5 Pro, meaning that Sony is willing to go ahead and scrap whichever ones are not successful and only give you the absolute best yielded product. We know that the PlayStation 5 Slim uses a 6 nanometer process, and so we don't share the same nodes as the ones that are used for that product. The PS5 Pro is exclusively using the 4 nanometer process, and because it is a different size than your typical RTX chip, there's just more of them on each wafer that they can choose from that pass the test. This is exactly how the PlayStation goes from 2304 cores all the way up to 3840 cores on the PS5 Pro. You also have a nice respectable bump in texture mapping units as well. So this percentage increase is definitely something worth noting. Now, aside from the CPU, which is pretty much the same as the base model, the actual GPU itself was designed with RDNA 2/3/4 in mind for the sake of backwards compatibility, which does limit the amount that they've been able to increase the power. But that is something that will be addressed in the next generation. This is still a pretty sizable bump in power based off of their parameters that they set forth when they designed this console. Now take a look at the 40 and 50 series in comparison from one generation to the next, specifically the 4070 and 5070. There is an increase in cores and in texture mapping units, and that comes out to about 4.35% of an increase. However, keep in mind that the 50 series does use a newer architecture, and so that may also multiply some of the power capabilities, given that each core is actually more powerful than the cores that are in the 4070. We also have to mention the power increase. A 25% jump from 200 watts to 250 watts going from one generation to the next. This is mostly in part due to not too much of an increase in actual transistor density, so this is a workaround for them to move to another generation and try to increase the power. They would either have to increase the die size, or they would have to actually increase the amount of power that's used. Which means that in short, they can either absorb the cost in the manufacturing process, or they could pass that cost down to you by actually just requiring you to draw more power and more heat. And where you notice the big difference in prices is where they actually do increase the die size, and in the ones where they don't focus on that as much, they're able to actually keep the prices a little bit lower, which is a smart move on their end.
At very large scale availability starting January.
Now, to do all that, we needed a larger and more capable GPU. This is what we used on the original PS5. It's a GPU from our partner AMD. The GPU on PS5 Pro is much larger. It has 30 workgroup processors.
And so therefore yield becomes the name of the game when determining the cost of the product. And so it being an enthusiast product, having the highest possible yields that are acceptable for the PS5 Pro, this explains why it is the cost that it is, because there are a lot of scrap these days. This goes down to the fact that Moore's Law is coming to a wall, where as we get closer to 1 nanometer transistors, it's going to be more difficult for all of these companies to achieve the really high-end yields that you would see on the 90s and 90 Ti's of the generations that they make. Sony could have gone with the older process, like the 6 nanometer process, and just increased the die size with that. But they actually did both. They miniaturized the node while also giving you a larger GPU size, which is what gives the PlayStation 5 Pro a pretty sizable bump, and that's why you see the percentage increases with the cores and the texture mapping units is the way that they did for this half generation upstep. And once we start seeing games that are developed with the PlayStation 5 Pro as part of the foundation of the game's build, the optimization is going to make this console even more prevalent as the fact that it is more powerful than we expected it to be. You also have to consider the fact that AI is helping move this all completely forward into a whole different arena of thought when it comes to processing power. Because what AI is doing right now for NVIDIA's graphics card is it's allowing it to really cut a couple extra corners for the sake of pushing the frame rates higher and maybe even lowering latency in the process, also using AI. Finding that balance is ultimately what I think these consoles and PC components are going to be fighting for. Fighting the balance between image quality, frame rate, and latency. But it must not be overlooked the sheer amount of shit that goes into actually developing these things. Just the base part of it, the main component, the actual chip itself, is damn near a miracle in the fact that any of these are even able to be made. And that's why you can't have a fab just anywhere. China can't build them in their country because the air pollution there would prevent the fabs from successfully creating it. Any molecules in the air, you so much as sneeze in a clean room and the entire thing can get fucked. So, I mean, for crying out loud, take a look at this. Just check this out.
These wafer washers use ultra-pure water to clean the wafer and then dry it with nitrogen or hot isopropyl alcohol. Cleaning the wafer happens rather frequently in order to remove any stray particles that may have fallen onto the wafer. And finally, sixth are tools that inspect the transistors and metal layers for defects and are called metrology tools. A common metrology tool uses a scanning electron microscope with nanometer-level resolution to take pictures of the top surface of the wafer and determine if there are defects such as improperly patterned layers or particles on the surface. Zooming in even further, we see layers of metal wires or interconnects, and at the very bottom are the transistors that form the basic logic gates. Note that these layers of metal interconnects aren't floating, but rather the empty space that you see is filled with insulating materials, thus providing structure and preventing the metal wire layers from touching. Furthermore, here we're only showing the transistors at the bottom and 5 layers of metal interconnects, with vias traveling vertically between the layers. Deposition tools typically have a central wafer handling chamber, with the various chambers attached to the edges, each one dedicated to adding just a single element or compound. The next category of machines do the opposite, which is to remove material. There are 2 key methods. The first is etching. Etchers use either corrosive chemicals or high-energy plasmas to react with and remove materials from the surface of the wafer. They're typically used with the mask layer stencil in order to remove the material exposed by the mask.
This is what actual nanotechnology is. Lightstone writing, etching, chemical vapor deposition, all of these use materials science and chemicals, very strong chemicals. You know, I've worked with a lot of these things, even just physically, like hands on, like literally hands on. These machines are obviously more automated to handle this at a mass production scale, but I understand the concepts here and all of the amount of materials, like you saw there uses gold and silver and all these other crazy things. Everything that goes into it justifies the price. Trust me. Yeah. Even that $2,000 GPU, the fact that they scale it up to get it to the point where, you know, the 5090 is just able to, you know, push things to the further envelope. There's a way to get it done, right? And that's kind of the whole point of this video, is to show you that that's exactly why it's the increase in power that it is for the RTX series. And then this is exactly why the PlayStation 5 Pro has the power increase that it has, right? Each one in their own typical realm of what they're set out to do and what price range it's supposed to be and this and that, whatever, right? They all have their own specific purpose. I believe console games are more focused on the 60 hertz or the 120 hertz experience with a focus on image quality, while as the PC side of things, they are focusing a lot more on frame rates and, well, raw power was the end all be all for them, but now it's the I guess you could say Moore's Law coming to an end. They have to look for other ways to try to increase things. There's some leeway here. It's a gray area. We're not exactly sure whether or not this is going to be successful, because I guess what people really want is more frames but without latency getting out of hand, right? That's the ultimate thing when it comes to gaming. Cloud gaming. What's the biggest reason that people don't like cloud gaming? It's not accepted because the latency is shit. Like, it could look as good as it can. Latency is shit. People got to rely on the internet to get a good connection. Cloud gaming, nobody really gives a shit about that. But when it comes to this, I mean, your actual physical media, right? Your the power components within the PC or the console, giving you the innate natural ability to accomplish the higher frame rates and the image quality and the graphics, the resolutions and all that. That's what this is really all about. And I'm going to show you that here with Digital Foundry's latest video, because this really shows and puts everything into perspective, because that's what this is all about, right? All of this crazy shit is for video games. And so let's finally look at some video games in action.
Apologies. So we'll have some thoughts on the improvements to super resolution and ray reconstruction, and some early frame rate testing to see the impact of the new frame generation options. Nothing's final here though, so there'll be no FPS numbers until review time, but you'll get to see percentage uplifts from the new 3x and 4x frame gen setups, and a snapshot of how 50 series frame gen stacks up against the existing 2x rendition on 40 series running on the RTX 4080 Super.
Cyberpunk is the new Crisis. It is the benchmark game that is used to showcase the technology in the graphics cards that have come out over the past, I guess you could say, 4 or 5 years. And with path tracing as, I guess you could say, the real final frontier when it comes to graphics, this is something that they really want to get to push. They want this to be mainstream. They want this to be playable. And so they're doing everything it takes to get the visual fidelity that path tracing offers. So that is the ultimate end game. But what that means is raw performance just hasn't been able to get up to par for it. I expect that that won't really be possible until we get down to 1 or 2 nanometers. And as of right now, if you look on the screen, you'll see that TSMC and Samsung are basically still at about 50%, 60% yields when it comes to successful nodes with the 2 nanometer process. And so you can't expect them to use that in production quite yet. But that time will come probably within the next year or two, and possibly when the 60 series comes out, then it'll go down to 2 nanometers or possibly even 1 nanometer, and then you'll actually see a real big jump in performance from one generation to the next. So with that being said, in my personal opinion, I think that the 50 series was not the most efficient jump for going from one generation to the next, since they had to rely on die increases to really get a much better performance for the 5090. And then the 5090 Ti, they're probably going to go upwards of $2,400 for that. But the 60 series is most likely going to be a real transformative jump that's going to take the next leap in raw performance. And I feel like that's where most PC gamers really want it to happen. The PlayStation 5 Pro GPU was also scaled up, and so having a larger GPU did manage to give it a good, decent power increase boost, but of course at the cost of making a more expensive console. So the next generation is really going to have to strike that balance between getting the chip nodes down, having high enough yields to where it's sufficient for the manufacturer costs, and then also optimization for games using AI to help developers produce games with more efficiency, also using AI to efficiently create higher image quality without having to render at the highest resolutions. All of these things are either going to be accomplished through raw power or through AI assisted technologies.
A heavy area in the game, and, well, the more complex the graphics workload, the bigger the gains you'll see. The percentage differentials displayed on screen here are in the moment comparisons, but across the clip, which is about 2.5 minutes in length, the combination of super resolution and frame generation, 2x frame generation that is, delivers a frame rate multiplier of 535%. Moving on to 3x frame gen sees that rise to 725% on average, while 3 frames predictably delivers the biggest increase of all, 913% versus native resolution rendering. The Blackwell architecture features custom silicon to do the job, explaining why the new 3x and 4x frame gen options are 50 series only. So here's a look at the frame time meter, repurposed here to show overall consistency. Now let's talk about latency. When DLSS 3 launched, frame generation was achieved by buffering an extra frame, then calculating the intermediate one. Both of these factors add latency, which was offset to a degree by NVIDIA Reflex. Latency was my key concern with DLSS 4's new multi-frame gen feature, but I've graphed PC latency here between frame gen 2x, 3x and 4x. And as latency can't easily be reverse engineered back into frame rates, I can show those numbers. You can see the in-the-moment readouts in real time there plotted over the content, but the averages across a circa 2.5 minute run through the black market work out like this. A 50.9 millisecond average latency with frame gen 2x rises to 55.5 milliseconds with 3x frame generation, with a 57.3 millisecond average with the full 4x frame gen option. So based on this sample then, we're looking at a 6.4 millisecond average addition to latency with frame gen 4x versus 2x in exchange for a 71% increase in frame rate, which is a pretty equitable trade, I'd say. So it seems to be that the majority of the extra latency still comes from buffering that extra frame, but adding further intermediate frames comes with a relatively minimal increase in latency. That means that the gameplay is still responsive in Cyberpunk, and unless you're super attuned to input lag, you're unlikely to tell the difference between 4x DLSS frame generation and the existing 2x option.
First and foremost, the frame generation completely off is what you see all the way on the left. You see how choppy it is. Now obviously this is with max settings, so this is something that is normally adjusted by lowering the actual settings of the game. What the intent here is to keep everything completely maxed out while still getting smooth frames. However, the latency that's shown when you're actually playing the game natively at that particular frame rate cannot be good. It just can't be. There's no way. And then at the same time, adding reflex to try to lower the latency down is only going to do so much. And so you're still going to have to compromise somewhere for this to actually be playable. Space Marines 2, baby. This is a shining example of what the PlayStation 5 Pro was able to do with its AI usage. I wanted to mention this. I kind of wanted to recap on something that I brought up before when I was talking about the amount of cores that are on the PlayStation 5 Pro in comparison to the base model. Also going from the 4070 to the 5070, where you see it go upwards of, I think it was like 5,800 plus cores all the way to a little bit over 6,000 cores on the 50 series. I can't necessarily compare core for core between the RTX and the PlayStation. That I can't do. What I can do though is show you more or less the image quality between the two. And then overall, based off of the overall memory bandwidth speeds, that also increases the smoothness of the game, which is what takes into consideration all the settings that are used in the presets of the PlayStation 5 Pro versus all of the options that you have on PC that allow you to customize and fine tune the experience to exactly what you want. You want to try to find that balance between image quality and frame rates and performance and everything like that to get the best experience. And so, with the PS5 Pro being compared to the 4070 for this particular game, I'm not going to try to say that it's trading blows per se, but there is a diminishing returns when it comes to some of these technologies that people pay for. But at the same time, you have to respect PlayStation for using the 4 nanometer process on the PS5 Pro GPU, because it does pay dividends here with the larger die size and going from 7 nanometers down to 4 nanometers. There is a sizable performance increase. Also, even with this larger die size, Sony was able to maintain a pretty decent power consumption rate for the PS5 Pro because it was brought down to a 4 nanometer process. So, not a very huge difference in power consumption. Another thing that I want to reiterate is that there are a sizable difference between a dedicated PC graphics card and a console GPU. So the actual size itself of the chip is very different, and this is why you see much more cores on a typical standard graphics processing unit, even with the disabled cores that come from manufacturing failures, such as the 5070, which would have anywhere between 16 to 25 or so defective multi-streaming processors that are disabled, or the 4070 series in this example. But again, the actual size itself, we can't really compare core for core between the two, like I was saying. So just keep that in mind when it comes to these consoles. Just the fact that the 4070 is able to run at native 4K at about 27 frames per second is still pretty impressive. The PS5 Pro having its own type of image quality that it has, using an upscaled version of either 1080p or 1440p up to 4K. This is something that also is very impressive, because with the size upgrade of the GPU and having the raw performance capability at running at a higher internal resolution, the PS5 Pro is able to have a finished product that is upscaled with a substantial increase in pixel count and overall quality increase. So certain games like Space Marine 2 is a really good example of how the PS5 Pro is able to get a really good image. As for the CPU in the PlayStation 5 Pro, it is imperative that they make a sizable leap for the next generation. And what better team to do that with than for Sony to be paired with AMD, who is leading the market right now in CPU processing power. So this is a very interesting development Project Amethyst is bringing to the table, because that gives them a very efficient way of moving into the next gen with all of the right components coming from one company, focusing on CPU, GPU, and AI capabilities. So PlayStation's in a good place right now, and the PS5 Pro is definitely going to be able to handle a lot of the games that are coming out throughout the next half of this generation. I honestly feel like the increase in performance for the PS5 Pro is a very efficiently made bump that also maintains integrity for the developers to allow them to easily develop for this console. I can't say the same thing for Sony's competition, because this current generation, they do have a specific SKU that is having some trouble right now with some games, making it harder for developers to actually release their games on. We're talking about Black Myth Wukong, we're talking about Baldur's Gate 3. This is exactly what the difference is between Xbox and Sony, whereas Sony wants to make the console with the developers in mind. That is something that I applaud them for, and we're seeing the results of it here. Now again, a lot of the things that the CPU is doing that is having some slowdowns in some of these games are things that can be addressed, where you can take some of these responsibilities from the CPU and put them more on the GPU for some of the upcoming games for PlayStation, especially first-party games. I expect that they're going to utilize this hardware to the best of its capability. I'd like to take this time to give a shout out to Pinoy Brad for this Space Marine 2 comparison video, and of course Branch Education, who does excellent work. Digital Foundry for their footage as well. My channel is not monetized. I don't do this for money. I just do this on the side as a hobby. You know, I have worked many hours and I do video editing for other things that are very important to me, and so this is just something that I like to do every now and then, and I hope you guys enjoy the footage. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you want more content like this. I will definitely be bringing up more gameplay from the PS5 Pro, because I have a ton of games in the back catalog that I'm going to start chipping away through when I find the time to do so. And again, this has been Ayalawan, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.